Hello, welcome to Small Talk. Welcome to Small Talk. Today's episode might be a little bit longer than normal, but I assure you it'll be worth it. This year, I decided to volunteer at TEDx. My job was to be in the lobby behind a desk, and as people came in, we'd check their names and give them a name tag before they go into the theater. During a quiet moment, I was looking over at the agenda, checking out the speakers, and then a title caught my eye, Reconciliation Through Music. And I thought, wow, what a great idea for our show. As it happens, the person who delivered that had just finished and entered the lobby. So I approached him, I introduced myself, I asked him if he'd like to be on the show, and he said yes. I asked him for a business card so that I could contact him later. And as I'm going back to my post, I read the name on the card, and it was like, oh, had I known who it was, I might not have been so bold as to approach him. Ladies and gentlemen, it is my pleasure to welcome the Right Honorable Stephen Point. So, Mr. Point, thank you so much for being here.
Not so sure about the Right Honorable, but certainly the Honorable.
The Honorable. Yeah. I wasn't quite sure. I knew how to say Honorable, but I wasn't quite sure.
The Right Honorable is generally, I think, previous prime ministers. You know.
Oh, okay, but I couldn't say the wrong Honorable. Anyway, for those, unfortunately, that day I didn't get to hear your speech. I heard it later on YouTube once it was posted. But for those people who haven't had a chance to hear about it, can you give us a little synopsis of what it was about?
Sure. When the Reconciliation Commission was established and they proceeded with their work under Judge Sinclair, part of the process was to bring speakers in to hear from people about reconciliation, and also to get those speakers to be witnesses. And in our custom, witnesses are people who listen and give feedback at the end of your process. So I was asked to be a witness, and then I got a letter from Murray asking that the witnesses continue in their work with reconciliation, somehow that they're committed. They're asking them to be committed to do so, and I said, sure, I should be happy to. So I'd already done the canoe project at Parliament Buildings, and that was a reconciliation project. So I'd written the song British Columbia, and I thought, well, why can't this become a reconciliation project? And so using music to bring people together. That's essentially what I want them to do. I wanted the schools to pick up on the song so that the choirs could sing it and the local school band could play it, and that they would be, because of the way the song is set up, required to bring in Aboriginal drummers, native drummers, to participate. So in the end, it would require them to have these two groups come together, right, in the school. And so the first part of the song, of course, is the drumming song. It's a slow beat, and it's the kind of song that you'd use for a canoe. And because in the old days, everybody traveled by canoe, they didn't have highways or anything in those days, people would hear their song coming, and by their song, they'd know who they were. So they'd go out onto the beach and welcome them. And when they finished singing that song, the people who were welcoming them would sing their welcome song. And this is just canoe protocol. This is international protocol between tribes. And so I thought, let's use a canoe song, or I wrote a canoe song, and bring in the song on this imaginary canoe, right? And then have the choir and the band brought in, the orchestra brought in on that song, and then have them sitting there. And as the drummers fade away and stop drumming, then the orchestra and the choir would sing the actual song, British Columbia, which is kind of like an anthem song or a theme song for British Columbia. And it talks about the Salish Sea, it talks about the land, and it talks about that we're all here and that it's a gift to us, right? And that we should hold it in harmony. I gave the song to the people of British Columbia, and I'm hoping that British Columbians sing it, that they begin to use the song as a way of reflecting on our current situation. That is that we are here, and that's our reality, and we should try to celebrate that as much as try to understand our history and try to make sense of our history, but we should also not forget to celebrate that we're here, and that's a good thing, and that we should try to figure out how we're going to be together and how we can make life good for our kids, sort of thing. And so this was my project through music to continue on with the theme of reconciliation.
We're just going to have a quick break. We'll be right back. So stay tuned, we'll be right back.
I wanna know all about you, your life's a story.
Get people to become more aware of what went on and what is still going on?
Yeah, well, one of the things that the Truth and Reconciliation Commission did was underline the history of residential schools. And for the first time, I think, on a very large scale, people were informed about not only the history of the residential schools, but the legacy left behind after residential schools. And I remember speaking with a lot of people who come and to listen to the speakers and talk to some of the elders that had gone through the system. And this was an amazing experience for them. It was enlightening. The first time they'd heard about it. The other thing that's happening, I think, in British Columbia for the first time is that we're seeing the general education system turn around and begin to create curriculum around the history of Indigenous experience, right? I think that history has largely been, in Canada at least, about the explorers, about the voyageurs, and about the discovery of Canada and that sort of thing. And that's fine and good. But a lot of the history is written from the perspective of those travelers, those people who've come here. And there's not an awful lot written about the Indigenous perspective, what it was that was going on when they seen these people coming and what happened when they arrived and the aftermath. The other thing that I see happening in terms of trying to bring a better awareness about information is the universities are also, a lot of them have indigenized, and they're starting their own Indigenous programs, and all of that, of course, is really important. I suppose, you know, when you look at the history, though, and what's happened with Indigenous people, you know, a lot of those people that experienced that went through colonialism at its worst back in the 1800s, went through the 60s scoop and the residential school systems, a lot of those people unfortunately already gone. They're already left us, and there's no way of recapturing some of that experience. But it's still, I think, going to be relevant to see more films, for example, being made about the indigenous experience, and perhaps more Indigenous written literature, books and plays about the Indigenous experience, so that One of the things that I think we've had a difficult time as Canadians is trying to find dialogue around which we can construct this history or reconstruct this history from the past in many cases. And a lot of tough words come out, like the word genocide, for example, and this has just been used in a recent report about the murder of missing women. And I think that this kind of dialogue, this kind of interface has to happen so that we can come up with words and dialogue that helps us to gain a better understanding without necessarily, if we can avoid it, at least creating more chasms. We can't shrink from the responsibility of gleaning a better understanding of our past, no matter how difficult it might be, no matter how harsh it might be. It is our history, it is what we went through, but we need to, at some point, take that historical page and begin to turn it. We need to begin to turn that page and start another page. In Canada, it's a really young place. I mean, you go to Europe, you go to India, you go to China, these are thousands-year-old cultures.
Right.
And in Canada, in my view, is young enough that we can actually begin to create better stories without shrinking from the responsibility of accepting what historically has happened. But if we begin to turn that page and we begin to tell different stories, you know, and we begin to create a different culture, maybe this melting pot that didn't work in the United States, but this cultural multiculturalism in Canada can begin to weave together to form something different. I think if mankind's have got any kind of hope for the future, we've got to learn to let go of the past. We've got to learn to create a better place for ourselves right now, make a different nest that we're sitting in, and bring our children into that nest, not the one that has the divisive rooms over race, not the ones that have the divisive rooms over religion, you know, the Catholics over here, these guys or sexual identity, all the divisions that human beings have we've built up, and we kind of, I think, flatter ourselves today that we're enlightened and, you know, we're above all of that, and the truth is, you know, that we have a long way to go as people, and part of that is dusting off our wings a little bit and say, let's try to be better people, and let's try to forgive and try to forget and try to move on without shrinking from the responsibility of actually looking at our history and saying, yep, that's what happened, right? But let's not stay on that rock. Let's move to the next rock, and the next rock that brings us forward as humanity, and always learning from those rocks, because we're going to just do it all over again in the next generation if we're not careful.
Yeah, right. I think we're taking another break. Is that what we're doing? Yeah. Okay. So we'll be right back. Stay tuned.
I wanna know all about you, your life's a story.
We're back, and I'm speaking with the Honorable Stephen Point. One question I'd like to ask you is your journey from growing up on a reserve to becoming the Lieutenant Governor of BC. That is some accomplishment for anybody.
One day you wake up and you decide that, yeah, you'd like to go to the mountain, and so you start getting ready with your boots on, and you maybe pack your water, and you get a map maybe and some flashlights, and maybe stick in your bag a few things to eat. Then you start walking towards the mountain, and then you end up at Parliament. It's like, how did you end up there? I I started walking, and that's how I got there. I've looked back on the trail that I've been on, and I can't answer you how I got there. The truth is that one day the Prime Minister phoned and asked if I would do it, and I said I would. I think to become a fireman, you've got to have certain qualifications, and you apply, and you wait for your name to come up on the list, you go for an interview and all that. But that's not the way it happens for people who end up as the Lieutenant Governor. The process ends and then somebody calls you. That's what happens. One day you're sitting in your house drinking tomato juice, and the next day you're sitting in this mansion with the butler and a cook, and they're bringing you crumpets. But my own traveling has always been about helping Indigenous people out of the dilemma that we find ourselves in the 20th century. When I first became aware of the right situation, I was in high school, and I remember wanting to write a paper in high school about the Indigenous people in the Chilliwack area. And what I found was there wasn't really anything written about the tribes here and who we were and what our culture was. And so my mom was friends with Oliver Wells. Oliver and her had been working on doing some weaving and traditional dyes for weaving and whatnot, and he'd been bringing her wool. And so she knew Oliver Wells and Casey Wells. So she made a call, and I ended up at the desk of Oliver Wells at his farm in Sardis. And he was what's called a local ethnologist. He was a farmer. He wasn't trained in anthropology. He was just someone that was interested in the local history. And so he did a lot of his own research, and he wrote a book. And so I got the pleasure of reading some of his field notes about the Chilliwack Indigenous people. And from those notes, I wrote a paper. And what I found out was, of course, that the name of the tribe, the Chilliwack tribe, and where they traditionally came from, and who they were and where they were when Europeans arrived. And that started me on this journey of what happened to us? How did we get here on Indian reserves in the 20th century? And why were we different from everybody else? And so when I left high school, I graduated from high school in 1969. I went on to university for a year and a half. Anyway, I left university, and I came home and got married and stayed home for about 7 or 8 years. I became the chief of the band.
Okay.
And the elder asked me to be the chief because he said, you'd gone to university. He says, you're the first one who left to go to university, and so he wanted me to become the chief. Late Robbie Sapass. And so I did. I became a chief at age 23. I was turning 24 that year. So I started attending the meetings of the Union of BC Indian Chiefs and listening to the stories, listening to the history, and listening to the struggle that the chiefs had started years and years ago actually to get rights recognition. And the more I studied it, the more I learned about it, the more I read about it, the more I realized that I wasn't really equipped to help. I was able to listen and attend the meetings and whatnot. I wanted to actually be able to do more, but I realized that lawyers had a particular place in society and an ability to understand the law. And so I decided I was going to go back to law school, to go to school. And I remember sitting up in the mountain one day watching the sun go down, and I was working in a logging camp, and I said, I don't have to do this. I could do something else. Someone else needs this job. I can actually go to university. So I got up and left. I went home and I got a job working for the tribal council, the local band office, and I was making about $1,100 every 2 weeks, and I took a job for $500 a month.
Oh.
And I had 2 kids, and I decided I was going to go back to university. Opened a law firm here in Chilliwack, and began working in the field of Indigenous law. And when I came back, though, the tribes asked me to get back involved with them with regards to rights, so I ended up as the tribal chairman there, brought them into the treaty process. It was through that journey, working with the people, working in law, working with the Union of Chiefs. I'd been on their executive. I'd worked with the Summit of Chiefs. I'd worked in national committees with justice. I started the House of Justice here in Chilliwack with the Stalo Nation. I drew their constitution up in 1996. It's through that work, I think, that I suppose I became on the radar for government people. But I remember the day I got the call. I said to my wife, he says, what's his name? And she says to me, Stephen Harper. And I go, oh, yeah.
Wow. Well, unfortunately, we're totally out of time.
Okay.
And there's so many other things I want to know. And thank you so much for being there. I really appreciate it. Thank you for watching. And this has been a great interview, by the way. Hope to see you next time. In the meantime,